Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your co-host Trevor Scott, with Matt,
How's it going?
and we are getting into our seventh team in our 32 team breakdown from a fantasy football perspective. We're going to continue going through the AFC North with our third team of this division, and we're getting into the Pittsburgh Steelers today. So Matt, I'll let you go from here.
Yeah, so Pittsburgh is kind of interesting. They had a lot of stuff go on this offseason. So just looking back at last year, they actually made the playoffs. They were 10-7. They lost to Buffalo, which was definitely expected. Pickett was benched sometime, I want to say early December. Rudolph finished off the year pretty admirably. I think he won like three out of his four starts. Didn't get it done in the playoffs, but obviously the big moves in the offseason were trading for Justin Fields, as well as signing Russ for dirt cheap, just because the nature of that situation in Denver. They also brought on Arthur Smith as their offensive coordinator. I know he's kind of the bane of the existence for fantasy managers
Can't stand
everywhere.
him, man. He thinks he's smarter than
So,
everybody else because he can play backup players
dude, yeah,
instead of
we'll
scheming
we'll
his starters open.
we'll definitely dig into him more when we talk about like the running backs specifically, but kind of an interesting decision in my opinion. Obviously, they fired Canada last year, and then didn't really have much going from an offense perspective. Defense is always solid. They've got TG Watt up front, which is great. But this was one of my favorite drafts. Just looking at the board in terms of taking a tackle with Troy Fautanu, who is obviously amazing, and I think is going to be a great addition. But in the second round, taking Zach Frazier, who's a center who can, probably start right away. And say what you want about Arthur Smith, like he's not shy about saying like he wants to run the ball. And if that's truly going to be your identity and get back to like old school Pittsburgh football, then I think this is just a slam dunk with those first two picks. Roman Wilson, they took in the third round, obviously losing Deontay. Roman's going to kind of fill that slot role. He's a good blocker, good route runner, reliable hands. So, I wouldn't expect too much from him from like a fantasy perspective, but in terms of, moving the chains, that I think that was a good addition. But yeah, overall, really good draft. So it'll be interesting to see how things shake out. I'll kind of kick it over to you to the fantasy stuff, but I know the first thing we're definitely going to be looking closely at is kind of that quarterback battle.
Yeah, I don't think it's a battle. I think that Russ is going to be the starter. They
And,
already
and they
came out and
said
announced that. Yeah,
that he's in first pole position or whatever BS. Yeah.
I mean they straight up said that he's going to be the starter. Obviously that can change, but I think he's going to be getting all the first team reps, and I think Russ is going to be the one that is going to be drafted as the starter. Now, obviously, from a super flex perspective, right, we've kind of had this underlying theme that you want the quarterbacks who are going to be their team's starters. And regardless of what they say at the beginning of the year, regardless of what happens in week one, if the team struggles at all, if the team gets in trouble, um, record wise, they could easily turn it over to Justin Fields and see what they have. My opinion on the Justin Fields situation is that a lot of the media, I think, did a poor job of covering why there wasn't more interest in him. The NFL is a business when it comes down to it. And the GMs know if you trade for a guy like Fields as a starter, that he's going to turn around next year and demand $30 million or more. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
nobody's doing that. So if you're not going to do that, you're not going to give up that capital to get a starter. Um, owners and GMs have to treat him like a backup before he's eligible for his major contract. And then, next year he can get a starting job for 15 million a year, kind of like a Jameis Winston type of deal, or, one of these other quarterbacks that gets a second chance, or Gardner Minshew, right? I mean, he just got a 2-year deal for less money. And I think that's ultimately what Fields is going to have to do to prove himself if he's going to ever be a 30 or 35 or $40 million a year player. And the Steelers' schedule lines up very different. It's very difficult at the end of the year. Like they get a lot of division games at the
Mm-hmm.
end of the year, which obviously this division is one of the best in football. And then they have to play Hurts out of division, and they have to play Mahomes out of division in like their last 7 games. So this schedule is just absolutely brutal. Come down the stretch, which from a fantasy perspective, right, you're going to have a lot of difficult games in the playoffs. So I don't know that this is a team that's going to be heavily targeted. I don't think either quarterback is going to be heavily targeted. I think it's going to be late round flyers on one of these guys. I will say that in Denver, Russ was very good until he got benched. He was bordering on top 10, if not in the top 10 when he got benched. I think he was 14 for the whole season, didn't play the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So, I think Russ can be productive when he's the starter. I did mention in past time that I think he's a natural fit with George Pickens. So I think that's very good that his top weapon is going to be somebody who complements his quarterback style very well. But in terms of draft position, with the uncertainty of possibly flipping it over to Fields mid-season, it's not somebody that you can invest in as more than a quarterback trying to get you off to a hot start, or somebody you can start early in the year while you're trying to figure out maybe a couple different quarterback options if you decide to wait on that second position.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just looking at Fantasy Pros ADPs for those guys, they're at the tail end. So I would, even in in 12-team league, super flex leagues, like we'd probably see them getting picked, but in 10-team, we might not even see that happen. And then with Pickens too, he's someone that I'm pretty comfortable with his ADP going into this year. They've got him at number 29. I don't know. I just feel like Deontay leaving is there's a lot of targets that are going to go Pickens' way, as well as kind of what you mentioned with the style of football that rest plays is kind of more suitable to his game. I guess I still am kind of afraid of the Arthur Smith thing, just because we saw how little London was targeted. However, London's quarterbacks were just absolutely horrible.
Terrible.
So I definitely have more faith
Bitter.
in that regard.
It's just like brutal.
I know, man. And I feel like Pickens actually has a decent floor this year, just with all the vacated targets. I guess, how are you looking at him going into this year? And it looks like last year he finished just around number 23 wide receiver.
Yeah, and Pickens is the ultimate boom bust player, right? I mean, it's nice to say that he's wide receiver 23. I would venture to guess that there's not a single fantasy player out there other than in best ball leagues who benefited from that 23 mark, right? I mean, he had so many down games, and then he had that random blow up game on like Thursday Night Football when he went for 2 deep touchdowns with Mason Rudolph in like his first or second start. So like, with Pickens, he's always going to be boom bust. Now, with these 2 new quarterbacks, I think there is at least a little bit better chance that he becomes a more reliable player. The problem is he doesn't go over the middle that often. He doesn't run very many short routes. It's a lot of 10 target, 4 catch type of games, or 6 targets with 4 catches. Like, I feel like the volume of targets with him hasn't translated as seamlessly as some other players to more production. I do like Pickens better this year than I did last year, though. So like going 29th overall, right? That's right in that Zay Flowers type of range. We talked about him manufacturing him touches in the last episode, but for Pickens, I think there's also a chance that they try and manufacture him touches. He's going to be the number 1. No more Deontay anymore at all either, right? I know Deontay was hurt kind of at the beginning of the year, so we did get to see Pickens as the number 1 a little bit. But I think full off season of preparing to have him be the featured player in the passing game will go a long way towards increasing his consistency. So at 29, I think that's a pretty good value. Honestly, I think he could fill in as a 3rd wide receiver or even as your flex player and give you weekly upside that's very, very much league or week winning upside, but also could give you 4 points and end up being the reason you lose. So
what do you
depends
think
on your risk tolerance on Pickens, in my opinion.
I was gonna say, what do you think his ceiling is?
Well, I mean, when you're talking about a ceiling for a player that is as explosive as he is, I mean, I think he could. I hate to give a ceiling number because I don't think he's going to hit a ceiling. And also like from the same exact team in a similar situation, I think back to Martavis Bryant. Um, Obviously he had like off the field issues, but like speedster in a big position to potentially, do really well. Mike Wallace on the same team, like speedster in a position to do well. He had a couple productive seasons, but like true upside here with Pickens is like top 8 wide receivers. I mean, if you're looking at the top group of like 6 or 7, that's pretty established. But then after that, you're looking at that range, I guess, of like Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, and AJ Brown. I mean, there's upside for Pickens to end up being in that tier if he can be more consistent, if Russ finds him on deep balls, and if he is getting 9 targets a game, kind of like he flashed without Deontay. I can see him going for 1,412 just because he goes if he gets loose and ends up catching a lot of deep touchdowns, he's so explosive with the ball in his hands that, upside wise, I don't think he breaks into the true top end wide receiver 1, but I could see him being a back end wide receiver 1 for a true upside. Now, obviously, I don't think that's going to happen, but you asked upside, and that's where I could see his max ceiling be.
I appreciate that. And then now to the running back dilemma that is Najee and Warren.
This one's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
This is the best running back battle / backfield to evaluate in the offseason. We talked about it a little bit with Zach Moss and Chase Brown. There's going to be other backfields that are interesting for sure, but this one for sure is a volume versus efficiency running back here. So, Najee's the volume player. He finished in the top 20 last year, while Warren finished outside the top, or finished inside the top 30 at 30 actually. And they're going roughly in those same spots in ADP this year. But the thing that I feel like is going to change those ADPs as we get closer to the season is that people are going to start evaluating Arthur Smith. And you just look at what he did last year in Atlanta with Tyler Algier when he had Bijan Robinson on the roster. It just feels like Algier shouldn't have been getting as many carries as he was. And that's like the inefficient player. If you have Warren in that backup role or in that 1B role, and that's your efficient player, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, he's getting a lot of touches, and wait a second, is he going to be overtaking Najee in terms of like touches because of pass catching, and they split the rushing downs? Warren could be an extremely good value right now. I really like him at RB30. He's another guy that goes around Zach Moss that I'm pretty sure I'd take Warren over Moss. Even though I'm not sure he's going to be the number 1, it just feels like he's a much, am I saying Moss? Yeah, Moss. It's a much better player, I think. Overall, at this point in their careers. So I just think that the chance of him becoming the 1A and having Najee kind of take a back seat to him, on top of the fact that if he just gets on the field a little bit more, if he just gets a couple more touches a game on top of what he did last year, he could easily exceed expectations in a big way with how efficient he is. So I'm trying also not to include this. I tried not to include this in the evaluation, but there is also the underlying context that Najee could get traded at some point this offseason. So if you're listening to this down the road, or you're listening to this as we get closer to the season, and Najee has been traded, like Warren is going to rocket up the rankings. He's going to go into the top 15. He's probably going to be, a 4th round, 5th round pick in super flex, probably in the early 4th round, late 3rd round, if Najee gets traded. So a lot to be excited about here. I elaborated significantly on Warren. So turning over to the Najee side of it, I think Najee at the beginning of last year, right? I mean, he was a very high pick and then didn't perform like that at all. He was very disappointing to start the year. I don't know if he had something going on, more nagging injuries. Like he had that weird Lisfranc the year before, and then just didn't look right, didn't look fast at all to start the year. But then, after the bye week, and then he started scoring, and then all of a sudden it's like he's running up 70, 80 yard totals every week, and ended up being a solid RB2, 2, 3 range at the end of the year there. So I don't know. I think Najee as a starter, like if you're looking for a starting running back, I think he can help fill out your roster if he's your first bench player. I'd be interested in there. At 20, I don't know that that's going to be a reality for how I just described that I'd draft him. So I don't know that he's going to end up on my team. But in our league, I could see him falling. So, you get into that 6-7 round range. I could see Najee turning into a decent value at that point.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good breakdown. I mean, I go back and forth with, Arthur Smith because on the one hand, he hates high draft picks and Najee was a first. On the other hand, he hates
Don't use your
efficiency.
first rounders.
Yes, he hates first round picks. On the other hand, he hates efficiency. So like something's gonna have to give. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's like a third string running back that gets a bunch of carries at the goal line. Just like last year with Jonnu Smith jet sweeps and whatever. But that'll be an interesting one. I do like what you mentioned about the potential trade. I wouldn't even rule out like the Chargers is trading for Najee. Obviously Gus and JK have had injury concerns. That would probably be more in season, but yeah, man, this will be a fun team to watch, especially because like I mentioned before with the draft, like the O-line is heading in the direction of being more of a strength when it's really been a weakness, since their kind of glory days.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, like you said, they've spent their first 2 picks on the offensive line. They brought in Arthur Smith, right? So obviously he wants to run the ball. So I think both of these guys are going to be a little bit slept on in drafts. I hope to see Warren improve that ADP, and I think we will see that as we get closer to the year, especially as more best ball drafts get into some of these ADPs. And yeah, so I think the running back room here for the Steelers is something that is going to be worth investing in drafts.
I agree. All right, man. Any last thoughts on Pittsburgh?
Yeah, the last guy, just to hit on tight end quick, Pat Freiermuth. If you're in a 10-team Superflex league like us, sorry, I've had to sneeze almost a couple times now, so forgive me on that. 10 teams, 1 tight end, Superflex, a lot of wide receivers, right? You're not really going too deep into the tight end pool. So at 16 in ADP, he's likely not to be drafted. But if you do wait all the way to the end of the draft, I don't hate the Freiermuth pick here. I mean, you saw Jonnu be relevant last year, and obviously they had Pitts, but the tight end was kind of a point on on Arthur Smith's offense to be productive. And if you had combined that into one player, it was somebody that would be valuable in fantasy, right? And so if you want to take a shot on one of these guys that are going much later amongst tight ends, Freiermuth is one of my favorites to take a chance on. And I think he's got all kinds of upside. He struggled with injuries last year, big time. But if he can get right, we already saw him in his rookie year be a very dominant red zone threat. And if he goes back to being that with, 60-yard games sprinkled in here and there, I could see him being a productive tight end.
Fair enough.
All right. And with that, wrapping up team 7 of our 32 team breakdown. And we'll be back with you guys tomorrow to finish up the AFC North with the Browns. And we look forward to talking to you then.